very glad to bring the first virtual forum out of the ACRL Access Services interest group, and I'm very glad to have Dwayne Wilson, who's the head of patron services at Brigham Young University, to speak about a topic that is probably near and dear to many of our hearts in relation to circulation policies. And I would like to at least reiterate that when we brought up this topic was something that Dwayne had brought up to a roundtable discussion at ACRL this year in Baltimore, and we had so much interest that there were basically 3 groups of people trying to go around 2 tables, and at that point is when I approached him later to ask if he would be willing to speak about this. And based on our participant count, I can see that this is a very popular topic. So hopefully you will find this interesting and useful. And before turning it over to Dwayne, I just want to also let you know that this is the first of 2 virtual forums that we're holding in the fall. We'll be doing this again in a few weeks on Thursday, November 9th, with Kurt Munson from Northwestern, who will be speaking about a vision for next generation resource delivery. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dwayne to begin his presentation, and then we'll be pausing every now and then to take questions via the chat box. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Brad, and thanks to all of you. I'm excited to have all of you participate today. I am Dwayne Wilson. As it says, I'm the head of patron services at Brigham Young University. And just as a brief background, I worked for 6 years at Southern Virginia University as the director of library services, and then came to BYU as the access services department head. And when last fall we merged the Learning Commons and its associated help desk into access services, we renamed our area Patron Services. So as you do have questions or comments, feel free to type them in the chat window, and then I'll go ahead and take a break at the end of the different sections that I have to discuss your questions. I will, as Brad mentioned, I was invited to talk to you today because of a very interesting roundtable discussion that occurred at ACRL conference this March in Baltimore. At this roundtable entitled "Are Circulation Policies Killing Circulation?" there was a lively discussion about circulation policies. It was obvious that these policies are on many people's minds, and that now is a good time to discuss ways to bring circulation policies into the 21st century. As all of you have likely heard, the ongoing decline of circulation in academic libraries is a long and well-documented trend. In ARL libraries, circulation has decreased over 50% from the year 2000 to 2015. As you can see from this slide, which data was pulled directly from ARL, the decline has been almost continuous. Most other academic library circulation statistics have followed similar trends. After seeing this continuing trend, it's very natural to ask why. Why would circulation be decreasing so continuously and regularly for such a long time? And is there anything that can be done to reverse this trend? You may have noticed that I chose a different title for this current forum than I did for my ACRL roundtable. After some comments at the roundtable, I realized that, though my title was interesting, it may have been a little misleading. I might have somehow implied that the decline in circulation was the result of circulation policies and that changing these policies might reverse the trend. Though I certainly think that circulation policies have an effect on circulation volume, the actual reasons for the continuous decline are much more complicated. You may have hypothesized, as have I, that circulation is declining because of changes in academic disciplines' use of print materials, the ease of finding information on the internet, a change in academic publishing, and perhaps that the current generation is simply lazy. And that was a joke, by the way. Though I certainly don't know the reasons behind the continuing trend, I do think that those involved with circulation should always be examining what they can do to help their patrons and serve their needs, especially in a changing environment. And I do think that aligning circulation policies with patron needs certainly makes patrons happier and can increase the use of library materials. In this forum, I'll first give an introduction to some of the assessments and research I've done that I'll be using throughout the presentation. I will then talk about circulation periods, number of renewals, fines, and recalls. In each of these discussions, I will talk about what I found from assessments. I will also briefly discuss the changes we made to help our patrons. I will spend a little time asking why policies may have been created in the first place and talk about how we can align policies with patron need while we are still meeting the library's needs. And just in case you're wondering, my conclusion is the spoiler alert that what I term loosening circulation policies not only provides better service to patrons and makes them happier, but it is better for the library. Most of the information I'll share today is based on a major assessment of circulation policies. that was performed by the Circulation Committee at Brigham Young University in 2012 through 2013. As the chair of the committee, I spearheaded this effort. I wrote up a description of how this assessment was performed, which was published in 2014 in the Journal of Access Services, entitled, "Why Can't They Keep the Book Longer, and Do We Really Need to Charge Fines? Assessing Circulation Policies at the Harold B. Lee Library." We used multiple methods to assess our circulation policies and determine if any changes should be made. The methods and publication information are included on this slide. As the Circulation Committee began its work, it quickly became apparent that there was no benchmarking information on circulation policies for our institution. In order to obtain this information, one of the portions of our overall assessment was a survey of libraries that was similar to ours in order to determine their circulation periods. The results of this survey were published in 2015 in the Journal of Academic Librarianship as Circulation Policies in Major Academic Libraries. Since I will be referring to data that can be found in this article throughout the presentation, I'd like to give a little more background about the methodology of this survey. We chose to send invites to heads of circulation or access services at ARL libraries in the United States and to other libraries at institutions that have a large enrollment. 76 of the 165 individuals that received the invitation responded. We asked questions about both circulation policies and the respondents' opinions of these policies. I will briefly share information about one further study I have done that I will refer to in this presentation. I chose to do a follow-up survey about circulation policies in libraries. I wanted to survey the same group of libraries that we surveyed in 2012 and expand the demographic to include institutions with smaller enrollment that only offered associate's degrees. I completed the survey in 2016 and the results have not yet been published. So let's talk about circulation period. I'd like to mention that during this presentation, I'll focus on the circulation of regular items in the collection and won't be talking about specialty circulation periods at this point. So let's go ahead and go to our first poll. If you could think about what your undergraduate circulation period is at your library and go ahead and respond. These different groupings that I've put in here are related directly to the results that I found in my survey, kind of different buckets where people put things in. And of course, I put the approximate weeks in there because different people refer to circulation period by days or weeks, depending on how long those different circulation periods are. So if you could go ahead and respond, and I don't think we'll leave the poll open for 5 minutes. I think we'll do it for less than that. And Lois will go ahead and close that poll. We have a pretty good portion of people who have responded. While we're waiting, I would like to talk just briefly again about that circulation data. So it looks like we'll go ahead and we've displayed the results. And like most people, it looks like the vast majority of you, at least those who responded, have that 30 days or less circulation period. As I found in my assessment of major academic libraries, we found that the median mode for undergraduate circulation for the groups we surveyed was 28 days or 4 weeks. A few libraries with more generous circulation policies pushed the average to 35 days. In what I would call kind of an unfortunate and telling statistic, though the average was a little less, the median mode for community patrons was also 28 days. In other words, large academic libraries typically gave the same initial circulation period to their undergraduate patrons as they did to unaffiliated users. This doesn't seem very appropriate given the fact that their undergraduate patrons are paying tuition and have a real need to use materials for their classes. For graduate students, staff, and faculty members, the median mode circulation period was 120 days or 1 semester. The average circulation period for faculty members was much higher than these, with 186 days. So as an aside, I've often wondered why the circulation period of 21 or 28 days seems to be the most common for library checkouts. There's no library literature that gives an explanation as to why this became an almost universal period for circulation. I've been left to wonder if librarians simply guessed on how long it would take to read a book, or if this was in some way related to a limitation on available systems or methods. So if you have any thoughts or any thoughts or insight on that, feel free to put that in the chat box. I'd love to hear that. part of the assessment that was done by the Circulation Committee was a survey of our patrons to determine, among other things, what they wanted for their circulation periods. Undergraduate students felt that they needed a book for, on average, 37 days. And so I apologize for this if this is a little busy, but if you'll see down at the bottom under the average desired checkout, and the red portion is what the checkout period for undergraduates were at the time. If you notice from the slide, for our other patron groups, they all had checkout periods that were longer than the average time that they said they needed the item. So we surveyed all of our different patron groups. This was a clear indication to us that there was a problem with the undergraduate circulation period. I would like to mention that I don't think this data supports shortening checkout periods for other patron categories. Though the desired need is less than the initial checkout period, this is the average need. In my opinion, the checkout period should not be right at what most patrons desire on average, but should be higher than that to take into account a patron who has needs that are greater than the average. So also as part of the study we did in the Circulation Committee, we analyzed statistical data about checkouts to find out how much time patrons actually kept books. We analyzed all checkouts from January 2010 to May 2013 to see the difference between when an item was checked out and when it was actually returned. We found a very similar result to what we discovered with the patron survey. Undergraduates kept books out longer than their initial checkout period on average, while other groups returned their items prior to the initial due date. If you look at the mean, of course, you'll notice that it was 20, which means that patrons did typically return books before their initial due date, but the average patron needed the book a little bit longer than that initial checkout period. With all this information, it seemed clear that undergraduates needed a longer checkout period. The real question was then, how long do undergraduates need books for? And you'll see all of our other patron groups needed books about, they had a time that was pretty appropriate according to their needs, what their stated and actual needs were. So we had some good statistics that, as part of our statistical analysis, that gave us an indication of what we would need as far as the actual checkout for books. Students typically kept a book until they were finished with it and then returned it at the due date. As a result, you'll see that books were typically returned at 7 days, 21 days, 42 days, and 63 days, with the 21, 42, and 63 being first the initial checkout period and initial due date, and then the due dates that would subsequently have happened after the item was renewed. After that, there was a long tail of books of patrons that would have either gotten an unseen or a seen renewal, or else would have kept the book out just because they wanted to keep it out for longer. From this, it was clear that almost all students' needs would be met if they had a checkout period of 42 days, but students who needed a longer period almost never needed the book more than a semester. We decided to give the students a 40-day checkout period, 6 weeks, which was double the checkout period of 21 days they had before. We then gave them the opportunity to renew two times without bringing the book back, or 2 unseen renewals. This gives them a total of 126 days, or 18 weeks, to keep the book without having to do a seen renewal. Since the typical semester at BYU is about 16 weeks, this ensures that students who have a project that lasts an entire semester do not have to bring the book back that they are currently using until the end of the semester. Our assessments were completed early in 2013, and we implemented our changes in January 2014. Patrons were happy with the change, and the library didn't see any negative effects. There was a decrease in the number of renewals, though this was expected since patrons didn't have to renew as much as they had in the past. I've reflected often on these changes, especially recently after I reviewed the results of the follow-up survey of libraries. I think that we did a good job in our analysis and our reasoning, but I think we might have been a little too restrictive in our circulation period for undergraduates. With the decline in circulation, there's very little need to hurry the return of books to the shelves. Since there is a clear use case for undergraduates needing a book for an entire semester, we should have considered that option a little more seriously. Though most libraries do still have a 21 to 28-day initial checkout period for undergraduates, those that are offering a more generous policy tend to offer a 120-day or 1-semester checkout. According to comments from the surveys, those who offer the generous policy are happy with the changes. So it looks like we've had some very active chatting going on, and so Brad, if you could help me with some of the comments or questions as far as what people have been saying or what questions they have.
Sure, sure. So there were a couple questions that came from that last slide. One of which was, were there fines for those items that were kept out longer, and wouldn't that affect the data when you were looking at it?
Interesting question. So I think what they're asking is, would the fact that we fined at the point at that time when we had those shorter checkout periods have affected the data? We'll talk a lot about fines a little bit later in the presentation. My impression of fines is that they don't, for regular overdue items, they actually don't have a strong effect. So though certainly I don't have that information right now, my guess is that it probably wouldn't. We will be doing another assessment of our circulation periods here this fall in the circulation committee again, and at this point we don't have fines, so hopefully that will help us to answer that question.
Okay. And another question on that slide, or something that you mentioned, was unseen renewals. Could you explain what that is?
Sure. This is something I found is typical at most libraries, though I'm not 100% sure, so maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. But so for an unseen renewal means that a patron can automatically renew an item online, or they can call in and have it renewed without having to bring that item back into the library. And so we have a policy where they can do that twice, and then they would bring the item in. If they still wanted it, they could bring the item in just to show that they had it, doing what's called a seen renewal, which would then allow them to have 2 more unseen renewals after that.
Okay. And there are a few more questions. Do you have time, or do you want to?
Let's go ahead with the questions. I think we'll have time.
Okay. And even I'm trying to get through the the chat window as well.
Sure.
So what ways do you notify students that their books are due or overdue?
That's a great question. I've found that notifications, since I hadn't put this in my later in my slides, actually are the most effective way of getting items back. So for a regular overdue item, we send out a notification at 2 weeks, and then again at 2 days before the item is due, and then I think we do another one at 5 days after. And so, and then we start into our process of notification that goes up to billing. So what I found again is that students tend to bring things back when they're reminded about them. And so those notifications are critical in making sure the items come back.
Okay. And then somebody asked to hear more about how you gathered the data about how long the average actual checkout is and what ILS system you use.
Right. That's complicated and would be very much dependent on each ILS. We have Circe Dynix Symphony, and so I have an IT person that we asked to extract information from the data tables, and another member of the committee was able to negotiate that, and then they had to format the data and put it into Excel. So it was actually a very lengthy, difficult process, and if someone has Circe, I'd be happy to talk to them a little bit more in detail about ways that could be done, or talk to my IT person about that.
Okay, and one last question before we move on, and then I can start capturing the other ones.
Sure.
So given the reduction in collection sizes from electronic sources, collections being trimmed based on usage, space being reclaimed for in-library use like study carrels, desk computers, etc., there would seem to be fewer copies of an item available for checkout as a general rule. Is that the case? And if so, should that factor in decisions about loan periods?
That's an interesting question. I think that's one of those specialty questions we get into, where we get concerned that an item won't be available if it's checked out for other patrons. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in my presentation. I think it's something to consider as part of the discussion, but I wouldn't put it strongly in the decision about how long the circulation period could be, because I think it should be more in the discussion of things like recalls or holds and policies like that. So that's my opinion.
All right, thank you.
All good questions. Thank you very much. Let's talk a little bit more about renewals. It looks like one person asked me to go a little slower, so I'll do my best. I do tend to go quickly in this kind of case. Let's go ahead and open up our next poll. And as I mentioned, we were talking about unseen renewals. I think I kind of explained what they are. I do think that many libraries seem to offer some kind of unlimited renewal if they are done as seen renewals, but I'm not sure. I haven't done a lot of research into that. So I would love to hear and be interested in whether people actually offer some kind of unlimited renewal as a seen renewal, or if there are any unlimited renewals they do are unseen renewals. But we'll let people respond to the poll and kind of talk about how that's going. It looks like a few people are talking about, as we're waiting for the poll, unlimited within the same semester, 5 renewals seen or unseen. So probably a variety of different policies and different libraries. So again, we just talked about an unseen renewal, but what we define an unseen renewal as is a renewal where a patron doesn't have to bring the item back in. They can renew automatically online or just by calling over the phone. So it looks like we have our poll displayed, and again, the vast majority of people do that traditional 0 to 3 renewals. That's very, very common, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as far as the results. And I appreciate those who are putting in the chat box there the kinds of things that happen to them. I have noticed, and I didn't put this in my slides, one person mentioned that there are system limits to a certain number of renewals. That's what I think I found in the responses to my follow-up survey. Some people put things like 99 or 999 renewals, and that was because of a system limit, is my impression. So as far as our results go, in the same survey of academic libraries that I've been talking about, the Circulation Committee found that the median and mode for renewals in large academic libraries was 3 for all patron types, except for community patrons who had a median of 2.5 and a mode of 2. Unfortunately, this does not accurately capture the picture of renewals that we have, since a number of libraries do offer a higher number of renewals and even unlimited renewals. What I found in that follow-up survey I did in 2016 is that actually it was only PhD granting institutions that offered unlimited and a high number of renewals, sometimes 10 or 50. Other institution types offered almost always the traditional 2 to 3 renewals. At BYU, we didn't change the number of unseen renewals as a result of our assessment. Because we changed the initial circulation period, the renewal period also basically doubled. Before, with the 21-day circulation period and 2 renewals, the patrons could keep the items for 63 days. With the 42-day circulation period and 2 renewals, they can keep the items for 126 days. Renewals are a very interesting thing. As you see from my slide, I think they're basically a reminder to bring an item back. Now, for some patrons, that may be annoying as they're trying to continue to use library books. I'd like to admit that I'm really not sure how I feel about renewals and how many should be offered. I like the fact that they remind patrons who might not be using an item to bring the item back, and I'm not sure expanding the number of renewals to a very large number is the best way to serve patrons. But I have noticed from, again, my surveys that those institutions providing more generous policies do offer an unlimited number, or a very high number, and they don't seem to complain or have any problems with these number of renewals. So are there any comments or questions about renewals? It looks like from the chat box, most people are sharing kind of what they are doing as far as renewals. And I'd be interested to see if it looks like some people do offer unlimited seen or unseen renewals, while some are giving a different policy.
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion, but there's 2 questions very related to each other that came through. One about, and pardon me for paraphrasing, there's so much discussion, it's hard for me to find the question again. I just wrote it. Do people with 120+ day checkouts have recalls in place? In other words, do they offer the recall option? And a related question, if books could be kept the whole semester, how do you handle recalls and renewals?
These are great questions. I'm going to discuss recalls a little bit later, but it would be great if people wanted to put in the chat how they handle renewals. I do think, or recalls. I think one interesting thing that we did find is that recalls had not affected our undergraduate patrons before, because we would guarantee a 21-day checkout period before we would do a recall, and then we would, of course, then we wouldn't allow the patron to renew the item, and we'd give it to the other person who had the hold on it. After we put in place our 42-day checkout period with that guaranteed 21-day period, undergraduates started to get recalls, which was disconcerting and frustrating to them. So I don't know the balance perfectly, but I'll talk a little bit more about recalls and some things related to that later on. Other questions?
The other one I saw was whether or not anybody noticed more damage to materials if they were kept out longer because of increased renewals.
Yeah, that's a great question, and people can put that in the chat box as well. At BYU, we haven't noticed any difference in the amount of book damage related to the items that, if they're kept out longer. We haven't done a specific study in relation to that, but we do keep very careful track of any book damage, and I haven't seen any additional concerns related to that. So.
All right, we're good.
All right, looks like there's some active questions and discussion. We'll continue on with our next topic. I'd like to talk a little bit about fines, and I've been surprised and excited about the strong interest in evaluating library fines lately. Even public libraries have been carefully thinking about whether or not they should be fining their patrons. I think it's important to make a distinction between some of the different fines in libraries. I lump them into two categories. From what I've learned from my surveys, the first I call the regular overdue fine. This is a fine that accrues on a book in the normal library collection when it's late being returned. And the second type of fines I lump into the reserve/equipment/other fine grouping. This is a fine that's typically higher and has a specific purpose related to more expensive or higher used items such as equipment and course reserve. I also would like to mention that some people get confused and include billing in a discussion with fines. When I talk about fines, I'm not discussing billing for an item that is lost or damaged, only charging a fee for items that are returned late. So let's go ahead and have a poll to look into fines at your libraries. What types of fines do you charge? Do you charge the regular and specialty item fines? Do you charge only specialty item fines, or do you not charge fines at all? And the reason, by the way, that I've divided these into these different sections, in my initial survey that I didn't divide the different types of fines, and I found that librarians made a very big distinction between those two, which of course makes sense. They're two very different things. And so in my follow-up survey, I got a little bit better information as far as the regular overdue fine versus the specialty fines that came about. Someone, of course, is talking about recall fines. I would leave those in the other billing types. I mean, I think that there are a variety of things that are done, but again, I'm talking about the regular overdue fine. So it looks like, again, we have most of the people that did answer have the regular and the specialty fines. A few do the specialty fines only, and a few do no fines. I'd be interested in talking to some of those people that are brave enough to do no fines. We haven't gotten to that point at our library, but certainly something we could consider for the future. So in my survey in academic libraries, we found that 75% charged fines. That was the initial survey. And then because of that lack of clarity in the follow-up survey, I asked more specifically about the two different types of fines. I found that 66% of libraries charged a regular overdue fine and 86% charged specialty fines, such as course reserve and equipment. Those libraries that had eliminated fines were very happy with the change and reported no additional problems as a result of not having fines. In May of this year, I had the opportunity to give a presentation at the Utah Library Association conference entitled, "Is It Time to Get Rid of Fines at Your Library?" In that presentation, I shared what I discovered about fines and some research that I had done, and I wanted to share some more of that with you as well. What I found is that there are 4 reasons that libraries and librarians typically state for having fines. These reasons are to make sure we get materials back, to make sure we get materials back on time, to teach patrons responsibility for materials, and to provide a revenue stream for the institution. Also in my research, I found that fines essentially fail in all of these stated purposes. In saying they fail, I'm not saying they don't have some kind of effect to accomplish their objective. I am saying that the problems that fines create are much greater than these stated purposes, and that they do actually fail in some of the purposes. As part of the survey we gave to patrons from the study I mentioned above, we asked them why they returned books. The 2 main reasons they selected were because they had finished with the item and because there was a due date. That was particularly interesting because of another finding in the survey of academic libraries. This was that 78% of librarians felt that fines helped get materials back. I found that librarians tend to focus on fines to get materials back, and patrons tend to focus on using the items and gaining access to them until they're finished with them. I wonder if perhaps librarians should change their focus to provide access rather than fines to punish patrons and get their materials back. So do fines work to get materials back? I don't think they do. The vast majority of patrons will return items anyway. For those that don't, we have a much stronger incentive than a daily fine to encourage the return. We can bill for the full cost of the item, and we can put a hold on patrons' records at the university. These work much more quickly and effectively than fines. A fine serves more like a slap in the face to a patron than an incentive for them to bring an item back. You may have noticed that I divided the purpose of fines between getting materials back and getting them back on time. Depending on how fines are set up, I think they can work to encourage getting an item back on time. That being said, what is the real importance of getting an item back on time? For a highly circulated equipment item or a course reserve item, it may be very important. As a result, we have high hourly fines on these items to encourage their timely return. But for almost all items in the collection, if they come back a few days or even a week later than the due date, there won't be any negative repercussions for anyone. As one article about the elimination of fines in public libraries stated, the biggest fear preventing more libraries from letting go of fines is that materials won't come back in a timely manner, and thus create longer wait periods for items with holds. The libraries who have implemented fine-free programs have proven these fears are unfounded. One of the things I've often thought about is the mistaken theory that we need to have patrons get their books back so that they can sit on the shelf just in case another patron needs it. Isn't it better for a patron who already has the book and is using it to keep it rather than making them return it just in case someone else wants it? If there is more than one patron that needs an item, then we already have a holds process in place to help with this. Another stated purpose of fines is that they teach responsibility. I have a quote that I found, which I think best illustrates how this purpose is going. Overdue fines have always operated as a hedge on that communal trust, the nagging little stick that comes with the big, beautiful carrot. Fines imply that a library's mission is not only to encourage reading, but to perform a kind of moral instruction. But does it make sense for libraries to perform both of these jobs? We've had 150 years to try to teach customers timeliness or responsibility, and I don't think that's our greatest success story. And this is a quote, so this is Lisinski, who said this a few days before his library system abandoned late fees. Reed put it more simply when she explained the message she wanted residents of High Plains to take away: "We trust you." Now again, this is a quote about public libraries, but I like much better the message "we trust you" than the message "we have to teach you to be responsible." Those who are truly responsible won't need fines to teach them that, and those that aren't responsible won't be more responsible if they have a library fine. I realize that there are many libraries that use fine revenue for a variety of reasons. Again, I want to reiterate that I'm not talking about money from lost books. I think that libraries should bill for lost books and damaged books if it makes sense, and they should use that money to repair and replace books. One of the things that I would like to ask each library is how much trust and use they might be losing because of regular overdue fines. Here's another great quote about this. Fines are a regressive method of raising revenue. They impact the most those who can least afford them. If you think about it, the middle and upper class student who has a library fine might be annoyed, but they likely can pay. What about the poor student who is struggling to get by? A library fine might just block their access to important resources that they need to succeed. I would feel uncomfortable getting library revenue while subsequently stopping a struggling student from using the library. At the ACRL conference in March, one attendee stated that they could only eliminate fines if it was a cost-neutral proposition at their institution. As a result, they eliminated positions at the library so that they could get rid of fines. The real question is there something you can do to eliminate fines and still meet your budgetary needs? Is the positive message of not having fines more powerful than the income in your budget? In my mind, the true effect of the regular overdue fine is to create a barrier to access for poorer patrons, to give a bad image to the library, and to give reasons for patrons to look for other sources of information instead of the library. According to my survey respondents, those libraries that have eliminated regular overdue fines, including ours, have only seen positive effects. There has been no additional problems with getting books back. It looks like we've had a very active discussion and comments, and so we can take some time to discuss these. And if you'd like, for any libraries that have eliminated fines, they're welcome to put in what they've done to deal with lost revenue. Brad, any thoughts or summary that you'd like to share?
I did get one question outside of the back and forth discussion. This is a very interesting topic as we're listening to you and also discussing at the same time. The question was about placing holds on university accounts and the concern about creating an even angrier patron. Yeah, that's a very good question. And I guess our philosophy here is that by the time what I've seen is that almost all patrons bring books back. Those that bring them back late typically have had something come up in their life where they haven't been able to get it back. And so by the time we've given them many notifications, many reminders and encouragements, etc., we feel like after a certain amount of time in our library, that's 30 days of being reminded and encouraged, that we need something more significant. I think there are patrons who try and take advantage of the system, try and keep books for longer than they should, taking advantage of the library, or might actually be into stealing books. And that's why I feel like these things such as holds are really critical. And it certainly does create an angrier patron, but by that time the patron knows that they've been very slow in responding. And we quickly take off holds at university accounts once the books are back. People asked earlier about different types of fees. We try our best to forgive what fees we can, and certainly a bill for the cost of the book, we forgive that. We have recently put in place a very careful kind of processing fee structure where we forgive most of the or all of the processing fee typically the first time, but then if a patron is taking advantage of the system, then we will charge them in subsequent times to try and make sure that they're not trying to take advantage of inappropriately of the library. So good points. And just a comment that came in related to the holds. Somebody just mentioned placing holds on university accounts can negatively impact financial aid and also block students from adding or dropping classes.
Right, and that is all true. And it certainly is a balance as far as what they choose to do. Again, we choose to only do that, and it happens very rarely. It's not very common based on the percentage of checkouts, but only for those that are struggling. Now, we have run into students that have gone away for the summer and their roommate was supposed to return the book, things like that. We work with people as long as they contact us. If they don't contact us, then it's hard to know how to help them or what to do. So.
Okay. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, we can take questions for a while. I do have some more content, but we could probably take, since there's so many questions, we could probably take 5 more minutes on this if we wanted to.
Okay. So one question was, have you found that students do not check their email notices?
Yeah, that's the universal question, right? It just depends on the student. What we've found is that students they have become used to checking for university communications. And some people say, oh, it's better to do text message or something like that. And maybe it is. We're going to experiment with text message reminders. Some of you have probably already started that. But most patrons we've found get notifications for email as much as they get notifications for text messages. And so though there always will be, and there still are students who don't check, most of them see their email reminders and respond to them. We do, whether or not it's effective or not, before we bill a student, we send out a paper mail reminder to their address, which, hopefully the theory is that that gets anyone who is just not getting any email reminder. And that's prior to them receiving their bill. And so if they respond to that, then their full fee would be removed and they wouldn't be placed on hold at a university.
Another comment that was put in that's sort of a different take on a lot of the others so far. I mentioned a former institution where I worked did not charge fines, but rather charged penalty points for returning items late. After occurring a certain number of points, they'd be blocked from checking out materials for a set number of days. It seemed to be fairly effective for most of our students, but they were a smaller academic law library, so it may not be effective in a large academic library.
That's a very interesting system. Well, lots of great comments. Thank you. And I hopefully you'll get a chance to read all of them later. Why don't we go ahead and continue on? And we'll have some more time at the end, I think, for other comments or questions. So I would like to talk, I would like to talk briefly about recalls. From our survey of academic libraries, we found that 88% of libraries would recall an item if another patron already had it checked out. I tried to ask that question in such a way that it would be kind of open-ended and we get a chance to see if they did a variety of things to get items back. When I did my survey in 2016, I asked the same question, and the top response when asked, what would you do if a patron had an item and another patron needed that item, 70% said that they would use interlibrary loan to get that item back. And so I need to do more research to see what the real trends are. What I've found, and you can see here in the slide, is that these are typically the things that are done as far as interlibrary loan. If a library is in a consortial group that does some kind of delivery, that's usually the most common way to go about things before interlibrary loan or a recall. And of course, recalls really are what a library's attempt at answering the question, what do you do when one patron has an item and another patron wants it? When recalls are the answer, usually what I've found is that the patron feels like they're being robbed, or that the library has a contract with them that somehow they've broken. And I realize certainly it is a library policy, all items are up for recall in most places, but it's still hard to get over that patron frustration. So with recalls, I'm still not sure what the best answer is. I think it really depends on the resources the library has. Are you willing to interlibrary loan? Do you have a good consortial group? And of course, are you watching carefully and have the resources to purchase additional copies if many items are needed? For libraries that have the option, again, consortial borrowing is the top option. At BYU, we used to do a recall by default. In other words, if a patron placed a hold on an item, it would automatically generate a recall. And when we made our other changes, we turned recalls off by default for a variety of reasons, one related to a system we created that I won't go into here. But now we only place a manual recall when we feel it's the best way to serve our patrons' needs. That way the patron and the staff can look at each item and see if it makes sense to do a recall, and instead of going ahead and doing a recall in every single case. I don't know if there are any questions or comments on recalls. Why don't I go ahead and do my conclusion, and then if there are any comments on that, we'll move forward. So in conclusion, In sharing this information with you today, I hope that you've thought a little more deeply about your own policies and how they might affect your patrons. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not sure if providing more generous circulation policies will change your circulation volume, but I do know that you'll be able to better meet the needs of your patrons. Meeting their needs can only make them happier and more loyal to the library. As I've mentioned throughout, and in my spoiler alert, those libraries that have offered more generous circulation policies have been happy with the changes. They've found that both patrons and librarians are happier. They've also found that there aren't any additional problems with return of books than there were previously. One of the things that's been most obvious to me in my research is that each library is unique, and things that work at one library might not work at another. I therefore would encourage each of you to evaluate your own policies and see if something else might make sense for your patrons. Please don't hold on to what has always been done just because that's the way it has always been done. How long do your patrons actually need books? Is there a way to be generous with circulation periods? Does it make sense to offer more unseen renewals at your institution? Do you really need to charge regular overdue fines? If you're able to make changes, it is very likely that you'll have happier patrons who are more willing to use your resources. So, if there are any questions or comments, I'd be happy to discuss them for a little bit longer until our time is up.
Yeah, we do have a question here right at the end, and then I have a question for you too. So
Sure.
Since I have a mic, I can do that.
No problem.
But this last question here is, what are other ARL spaces working on with fines policy changing? Somebody you'd like to keep connected as they're evaluating their own policies at their library.
That's a great idea. I don't think there are any ARL spaces, and that might be something we might want to create or talk about in our ACRL groups or other places to discuss these things. So,
yeah. And I will admit I'm writing that down myself. It's something that we may even either tackle or discuss as part of the interest group discussions as well. And then another question is, are there links to your research, or is that something that if you send it to me, I could send out to the group as well?
Yeah, so I've put up my references in the published items. Those are available. And if there are other things, some of these things that I've done haven't been published, the most recent study and some of the parts of the circulation study, and maybe they should be, because that data and the statistics on patrons, what patrons would like, their opinions as well as the statistics probably would be interesting to some other people. And so I'm happy to do that. As far as emailing presentations, I noticed someone mentioned that. I don't have individual emails, but I know that this broadcast will be made available to everyone. And if people are interested, they're welcome to email me directly, and I'd be happy to provide slides, and I'll put my email in the chat box for anyone who's interested.
Great, thank you. Another question was, have you modified your reserve fine policy in any way at BYU since you eliminated your normal collection overdue fines?
That's a good question, and I'd be interested, as part of that discussion group people mentioned, I'd be interested in talking to people about reserve fines. We have not changed our reserve policy as a result of this. My opinion, the regular overdue fine didn't have a lot of effect, but those high hourly fines seem to. And as librarians, we're concerned about the high use of reserve items and making sure that they're available to all the different people that need them. Now, as a kind of a funny side note, we recently looked at our reserve fines. For some reason, they were $1.20 an hour, and no one could understand why they were that kind of odd number. We decided to move them to $1 an hour just to make them more of a round number that made more sense and maybe was a little less stressful for patrons. So just kind of as an aside.
Okay, somebody asked, actually I've asked this question too, has anybody ever considered asking the student how long he needs the book rather than imposing an institutional-wide limit?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'd love to hear comments on that. I haven't seen anything about that in any research I've done. The only really unique circulation experiment I heard, which was done many years ago, was to provide a different due date for items depending on how much use they got, and items with higher use were given a shorter due date, and items that weren't used as much were given a longer due date.
And I'm just scrolling through the questions again.
And it looks like some people do that according to the chat, which looks really interesting. So.
Yeah. So something I wanted to ask, especially since you mentioned alternatives to recall at the end, and some of the comments, especially as it related to resource sharing policies, what are your thoughts about having those conversations between those people who are making circulation policies and those who are making resource sharing policies at the institution to help to sort of align in the thought of how you're using your local collection?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Interestingly enough, I don't know, maybe could you read the question again, because it seemed like, yeah, before I respond to that, let me make sure I understand.
Oh, it's my question, I'm sorry.
Share your question out loud one more time then, Brad. Thank you.
So often circulation policy discussions are made outside of resource sharing policy discussions.
Right.
And in the context of thinking of different ways to allow for people to use materials, I just wonder what your thoughts are about those two groups working in conjunction with each other rather than sort of as separate functions.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. The ironic thing is that I'm over resource sharing at my institution, and I haven't really began or thought about those particular conversations. A few years ago, our consortial group that we're part of, the Greater Western Library Alliance, decided to offer an initial interlibrary loan period of 12 weeks for all of the items, and which is much more generous than our local circulation policies. And I have thought a little bit about how odd that was that they're not the same. One thing that did happen is that interlibrary loan has never charged a fine at our institution, and so I was grateful when we eliminated overdue fines to match that. But I think that would be I think that's a good idea. We haven't tried that ourselves.
And I do have one other question here. Somebody said, I also agree that recalls lead to far more confusion and anger than simply making it known they need to return or renew an item at a specific point. Do you find that the incidence of recalls is low enough to offset the increase in patron frustration versus the increased incidence but less confusing in fine sums? So I think what they're saying is it by having these sort of manual recalls, is it low enough to offset the increased incidence of these fines?
Yeah, I think I'm understanding the question. I mean, what we get about recalls, you know, we received a lot of complaints before about how frustrating it was that patrons didn't get the books in time. And we haven't done an assessment to see if patrons are really frustrated now about, or I'm sorry, the recalls was not complaints about getting the books back in time, but rather about having to return their book when they weren't finished. But with eliminating recalls, of course, the question is, are patrons that need a book getting the book in time or when they actually need it? And I guess the reality is that people complained a lot louder about recalls than they do about not getting their books in time, or else people are happy with the change. I'm not quite sure. Because we've tried a variety of things. At BYU, we developed a system, kind of an overlay to our ILS that would allow us to do what we call a blanket hold. In other words, a hold on all of the items in a collection with the same title, so that we would be able to get hopefully an item to a patron more quickly if they didn't need a specific edition. And as far as I can tell, the current system we have is more successful, and we don't have as many complaints about a patron having to wait a long time. So I think the manual recall system is working okay. I don't think it's perfect, but we get a lot fewer complaints about recalls, certainly, and we don't get very many complaints at all about, you know, needing a book faster than people are getting it. So I don't know. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay. And I think we have time here for a couple more. I see one. When a patron is frustrated with recall, do staff members reach out and let them know about other options such as consortial or interlibrary loan possibilities?
Yeah, we always do. We always do our best to let patrons know. What happens now, actually, is that if for a patron who has requested an item, placed an item on hold, and they can't get it back, they automatically receive an email after a few days telling them, oh, we haven't been able to find this yet, maybe you should try interlibrary loan, which helps with that particular patron. And then if an item is recalled, we send them an email that details their options as far as what they can do for getting the item back. And really the reality is, what we discovered is that almost all recalls are done to faculty members who have had the book forever and it's been sitting in their office sometimes, for a year or more, and they're not actively using the item. And so, though it is possible that a patron is actively using an item and we give them options if they need it, most of the time the recalls we do now don't affect the patrons who are needing the item.
All right. I think that is I'm just having a look. We're getting more, I see these are question marks, but then it seems as part of the discussion that's going on in the chat window here.
Yeah.
I think we have reached the end of the questions related to the content that you've been talking about, and I just wanted to thank you so much. It's obvious from the number of people in such an active chat that this is a topic we could probably talk about over and over and over again. I really do want to thank you, Dwayne, for today, and also sharing the research that you've been doing over the years in relation to circulation policies.
Thank you. It's been a real privilege to be able to have this opportunity.
Great. And before we let go, as I said, I just want to make another reminder. We do have another Access Services Interest Group virtual forum on Thursday, November 9th. And that's at 2 o'clock Eastern time with Kurt Munson at Northwestern, who will be speaking about a vision for next generation resource delivery. Other than that, we are also putting together another behind-the-scenes tour at Emory's Library during the Access Services Conference in November. And stay tuned as we also look at our programming for the spring, and hopefully another tour at Midwinter in Denver next February. Other than that, I just want to thank everybody for sticking around and attending, and as usual, very much appreciate Dwayne with his time and all of you for listening.